Hi, I'm Tony Denbach, the lead pastor of Clearview Community Church, one church in multiple locations serving the communities of the Georgian Triangle. Thank you so much for joining with us today. American novelist John Grisham was an attorney who hated his job. He wanted to become an author, but he didn't know where to begin. And finally, he decided to start by writing a one-word message to himself on the early morning squares of his monthly calendar. Write, Grisham said to himself. I'm going to get to work 60 minutes early each day, and I'm going to write just one page per day. And that's what he did. He's been called America's favorite storyteller, and he has now authored, get this, 49 consecutive #1 bestsellers, all because he decided one day to do what was important. He learned to put first things first. Now, John Maxwell shared something in his book about team players that I've kept and I wanted to pass on to you today. He said, my friend Dwight Bain sent me a story of a ham radio operator who one day overheard an older gentleman advising a younger man on the air. It's a shame you have to be away from home and your family so much, he said. Let me tell you something that has helped me keep a good perspective on my own priorities. You see, one day I sat down and did a little arithmetic. The average person lives for about 75 years. Now then, I multiplied 75 times 52 weeks in the year and came up with 3,900, which is the number of Saturdays that the average person has in his lifetime. It took me until I was 55 years old to think about all this in any detail, he continued. And by that time, I had lived through over 2,800 Saturdays. I got to thinking that if I lived to be 75, I only had about 1,000 of them left to enjoy. He went on to explain that he bought 1,000 marbles and put them in a clear container in his favorite work area at home. Every Saturday since then, he said, I've taken one marble out and thrown it away. I found that by watching the marbles diminish, I focused more on the really important things in life. There's nothing like watching your time here on this earth run out to help you get your priorities straight. And then the older gentleman finished. Now let me tell you one last thought before I sign off, he said, and take my lovely wife out to breakfast. This morning, I took the very last marble out of the container. I figure if I make it until next Saturday, then I have been given a little extra time. Now, we can't choose whether we will get any more time, but we can choose what we do with it. Now, if you are intentional with what you have, then you will make the most of the time and talent that God gives you. Today, we're going to continue looking at the events leading up to that first Easter weekend. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we heard about Jesus taking time to meet up with a man by the name of Zacchaeus, demonstrating his priority for people. And this morning, we're going to move on from there to the week before Jesus' trial and crucifixion. And that week began with what we call the Triumphal Entry. And this scene begins in Luke, the 19th chapter, in verse 28. And here Jesus had set his direction towards Jerusalem, recognizing that there he would give his life. He gives instructions for 2 of his disciples to go to a nearby village and find a donkey colt, which is tethered, a colt that had never before been ridden. And when the owner asks what they're doing, they're simply to reply that the Lord needs it. Well, this was typical of royalty in that day. Everything in the kingdom was at their disposal. This little exchange spoke of the sovereignty of Jesus over humanity. Now, when they brought the colt back to Jesus, the text tells us that they put Jesus on it. Now, I'm just a little curious today as to whether or not there's anybody watching who's ever ridden a donkey. Anybody who's maybe ever been the first person to ride a particular donkey. See, from what I understand, they're not too keen on being ridden. In fact, for donkeys as well as for horses, there's a process they call breaking. And during this time, the animal is gradually made used to having a weight on its back. Well, here we are told that this animal had never before been ridden, and yet there is no indication that it objected whatsoever to Jesus riding on its back. Here, Jesus demonstrates his sovereignty over nature. And as Jesus was traveling along the road towards Jerusalem, the people would throw their cloaks and their palm branches on the road in front of him, as today we would lay out a red carpet for royalty. And they began to shout, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." It's from the Psalms. It had messianic meaning. And when the Pharisees demanded that Jesus stop the people from saying these things, Jesus said, "If they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." See, there was something about this moment that was so profound that it absolutely demanded praise. Now, the people didn't really understand what was going on, because the record indicates that within just a few days, some of these same people who were yelling those wonderful things would be yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." But here we read that if they didn't lift their voices in praise, the very rocks would cry out. Now, why was this moment so profound? I believe we see at least part of the answer in verses 41 and 42. It says, "As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, 'If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes.'" This day, he said. Now, scholars have calculated that this was the exact day that Daniel had prophesied about hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, when the full coming of the kingdom of God would be postponed because of the rejection of the Messiah. Daniel had talked about it and prophesied about it to the day. This day that could have been a coronation became something completely different for the king. The people were celebrating. The people were shouting and lining the streets, but we see Jesus as he approached the city. From his vantage point, this was not a true celebration. It was a missed opportunity. Listen to Jesus' own words here. "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." And Jesus wept. It was an opportunity missed. See, I think it's very interesting that Jesus, 1 week before his death, is weeping for the city of Jerusalem and not for himself. See, some 40 years later, in 70 AD, the Roman legions would sweep into Jerusalem and completely destroy the city. The temple would be torn down so that not one stone would be left on another, as Jesus said in another place. The people of Jerusalem and all of Israel would be scattered to the four corners of the earth and would not return for more than 1,800 years. Jesus wept. Matthew records Jesus as saying in Matthew 23 and 37, "O Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." See, scenes like this happen all too often in the world. They're certainly not of such a great consequence as this event, but how often do we see missed opportunities? Well, what do missed opportunities represent? Well, first of all, they can represent wrong choices. See, one of the truths that I stressed repeatedly in my dealings with people is that choices have consequences. You can choose whatever you want to, but you're not free from the consequences of your choices. All of us have choices to make, some of them with minor or no visible consequences, others with huge consequences. As Stu Weber wrote, life is full of them. Every day and every hour is full of them. Options, alternatives, paths, and decisions, lots of branching trails, each one encountering crossroads. But the big one, the biggest fork in the road you will ever come to, has a sign over it that reads, "Who will be my authority? Whom will I choose to follow?" See, this was the choice that the people of Jerusalem had on this day. This is the same choice that we face today. To them, there were national consequences. To us, they may be individual, may be related to our families, maybe even our towns and our society. But choices have consequences. And missed opportunities, though, also represent wasted potential. So, what could have happened? What might the outcome have been? We'll never really know this side of heaven. But what occurred during this week, some 2,000 years ago, represented either the wasted or the realized potential of a great many people. See, arising from the events of that week, we see a small band of men and women whose lives were transformed because they chose to follow the one who claimed to be the Messiah. The potential was realized in simple businessmen, in fishermen, and tax collectors who believed that what Jesus said was really true. People's lives were transformed, and the world was changed. One of the mightiest empires in history was eventually brought to its knees because some people took Jesus at his word. Now, they weren't the most talented. They weren't from the best families. They weren't the most educated people. Jesus said, "Follow me," and they did. Now, many others refused to come and follow. In fact, shortly after Jesus' death, a campaign was launched to crush this small group of his followers. The world became a very dangerous place for Christians, as it is in many places in our world still today. Some chose to fight against the message of Christ. Some chose to ignore the message of Christ. And others chose to embrace that same message. Now, a story about William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, can give some perspective on the potential for good or evil in any situation. You see, during the early days of the Salvation Army, William Booth and his associates were bitterly attacked in the press by religious leaders and government leaders alike. And whenever his son Bramwell showed Booth a newspaper attack, the general would reply this way: "Bramwell, 50 years hence, it will matter very little indeed how these people treated us. It will matter a great deal how we dealt with the work of God." See, in every situation, we are called to do the right thing. When we do the right thing, we bring to pass whatever potential there may be in a situation. Now, I want to touch on one more important scene before I'm done here today. And that is found in Luke, the 19th chapter, verses 45 and 46. It says, "Then he entered the temple area and began driving out those who were selling. 'It is written,' he said to them, 'My house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers.'" See, in the temple, there were always sacrifices taking place designed to atone for the sins of the people. Jesus fulfilled that process. Originally, many of the people were either shepherds or farmers and lived close by. In the days described here, the people were often in other lines of work, and many traveled to the temple, and they often did not have what they needed for the sacrifice, and often they didn't even have the right currency for it. So, the religious leaders set up booths for currency exchange, for which they charged a premium, of course. They also set up booths for the selling of animals for the sacrifice, for which, of course, they charged a premium. And as bad as this was, these were not the main reasons that Jesus reacted as he did. See, the Jewish nation was chosen by God to be a light to the world. The Abrahamic covenant, God's promise to the patriarch of the nation, Israel, specified that through them all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And one section of the temple, which God had designed, was given over to those who were not Jews, but who would come to worship the God of Israel, Gentiles. Yet which section do you suppose was used for the financial quarter of the temple? Exactly. The Gentiles were not even considered. And so we have a people ignored. Now, for those of you who are students of the Bible, you will remember that back when God made a covenant with Abraham, he promised, again, that through his descendants, the Jewish people, all nations of the world would be blessed. That was the point. It wasn't for one nation, it was for all nations. They were called to be a light so that all nations could see their way to a relationship with God. And yet here at the temple, where those meetings with God were to have taken place, the court of the Gentiles, which God had commanded to be built, was being used to generate huge profits for merchants who were taking advantage of their own people. And where were the Gentiles? Out of sight, out of mind. So let me ask a question. How do you think God feels when people he loves are deliberately excluded? Well, Luke tells us that Jesus began driving out the merchants. In Mark's gospel, more detail is given. We see a picture of what is called righteous indignation. We see what makes Jesus angry and provokes him to militant action. He goes up to the tables where they're exchanging currency and flips them in the air. Imagine coins bouncing off the limestone floor and the buyers and sellers trying to collect what they could before making their escape. So what makes God angry? Callous indifference. See, the Jewish nation had been given the light to share with the world. Instead, they covered it up and they kept it for themselves. Worse yet, they took a place that was designed and purposed for the worship of God, and they used it to take advantage of people. So, in the final two verses of this chapter, verses 47 and 48, we read this. Every day he, Jesus, was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it, because all the people hung on his words. These were the final days of Jesus' life. You can learn a lot about a person by observing what they do in the final days of their lives. We see the priorities of Jesus in these last couple of chapters. We've seen him embracing children because they matter to God. We've seen him spend time with blind Bartimaeus and restore him completely, another outcast. We've seen him go to have a meal with one of the most despised men in Jericho, Zacchaeus, and watch Zacchaeus' life be transformed by the grace of God. Jesus wants to make it clear that God loves people, all people. He is removing barriers so that the marginalized and the outcast, everyone can have a place in God's house. Those were Jesus' priorities. And those should be our priorities. Now, this past week, I had the privilege of attending our denomination's national conference, where over 1,300 pastors gathered together from all across Canada for meetings. In one of those meetings, we honored one of my mentors, a leader by the name of Bill Morrow. He served in various capacities over the years in the church. He's been a pastor, he's been a teacher, he's been a counselor, college administrator, a district superintendent, and a national superintendent. He's approaching 80 now and has just taken on the role of interim president of Master's College and Seminary. And here's what he said in that meeting. He said, no matter how old you are, if you still know who you are and where you are, make a difference for the kingdom of God. That's great advice. Now, I don't know how many marbles you might have left in your container, should you follow the example of the man I spoke of at the beginning of this message, which I would encourage you to do. But this week, you have one less than last week. So use your time wisely while you have it, and remember to put first things first. Would you pray with me today? Dear God, you know each of us by name. Jesus, you came to help us. Help us to open our hearts to you. I pray for every person who is listening today, that they would sense your presence and open their hearts to you. Though we are sinners, you love us. Forgive us our sin through Jesus, who gave himself for us. So go from this place with the confidence that God has come to us. He has sought us, he has found us, and he has redeemed us. Be inspired by his grace, humbled by his love, and empowered by his Spirit. Let him live in you and through you. May you be his hands and his feet in a world in need. Should you wish to reach out for us, we would love to hear from you sometime this week. You can email us at clearviewchurch@rogers.com. Thanks for watching. God bless.